Tim Kanold is an award-winning educator and author, and a national thought leader in mathematics, wellness, and the professional learning communities at work model. He is former director of mathematics and science and served as superintendent of Stevenson High School District 125, a Model PLC at Work district in Lincolnshire, Illinois. Dr. Kanold is committed to equity and excellence for students, faculty, and school administrators. He conducts highly motivational professional development leadership seminars worldwide with a focus on turning school vision into realized action that creates greater equity for students through their effective delivery of the PLC process by faculty and administrators. He is the past president of the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics and co-authored several books selling mathematics textbooks over several decades. Dr. Kanold has authored or co-authored 13 books on K-12 mathematics and school leadership since 2011, including the 2018 Gold Medal IPPY award-winning and best-selling book, Heart. He has also authored the best-selling book, Soul, and his most recent bestseller, Educator Wellness, with Dr. Tina Boogring. And so without further ado, let's welcome to a conversation with Brian, Dr. Tim Kanold. Tim, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Brian. It's so great to be here with you. I really appreciate it.
You know, when I put together that promo or that intro, I realized that you've probably written more books since the intro. You're just a prolific writer. And so I may have made a mistake, but, you know, I am so glad that you're on. And again, thanks for joining me.
You're more than welcome. And I like the intro, too, because the picture and the video part, I look a lot younger, so I really appreciate that.
I don't know about that. Hey, in the video, the intro, we talked about, you know, some of your bestsellers, and in this book behind me really was something that just almost, you know, I shouldn't say almost, literally sped up the trajectory of my thinking, my career. When I read this book, Tim, Heart, and looked at the chapters and went chapter by chapter and reflected on the questions that you had in each chapter, and had us at the end having written basically our story. It was amazing. But I want to start with this in your book. I'm going to read this to you, and I'm going to ask you just to respond to it. Václav Havel says, "The salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart, in the human power to reflect, in human meekness, in human responsibility." This book is about the very human heart for our work as educators. It's about feeling and seeing the genius, and that's special to me, the genius in every child. It is about deep reflection. It is about a happy and healthy humility of spirit combined with a passion for our responsibility to help each and every student and colleague that joins us along our career path. That's pretty powerful, Tim. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can. You know, I think that part of understanding that particular passage comes out of the fact that I decided to write Heart because our colleague and a mentor to both of us, a man by the name of Rick Tefor, was dying of stage 4 lung cancer. And he and I had worked together for almost 32 years. I think what I describe in that passage is the commitment we both made as educators to try to improve the learning of all students, and not just in our school district, but you know, throughout the country. And I think I wanted to capture kind of what I call the heartprint in the book of his spirit. And my own perhaps too, but I think really the spirit of all educators in terms of what it means to give your life to this profession. Ultimately, what is the story that we tell as educators? And I have to tell you, when I wrote that, I wrote it somewhat in a vacuum, like in the sense that I had no idea if people would even care about what I was writing. Like would they really connect to the story, or would they connect to this aspect of their work life? I think even Solution Tree as a publishing company was a little surprised at like just the enormous reaction we had to the book, and the hunger that we all have, I think, to figure out our own story
Yeah,
and be the architects of it.
sure.
Uh, I do believe we sort of beat the path as we walk it, and so we have all these choices to make. And it was, I think I've always felt that it's just not sufficient to have great academic knowledge about our subject matter. We must also have an outreach and a heart for our students and our colleagues. And that stewardship is a really important part of who we are as educators. Don't get me wrong, I didn't understand that in my first 12 years of teaching. I looked very inward. I think it takes quite a bit. It takes a little bit of time sometimes to get to a place where you're saying, oh, I'm in this profession of others,
Yeah.
and I have to pay attention to that.
One of the things in the book that really kind of resonated with me is this idea of finding yourself, like finding myself, right? And so you kind of mentioned it a little bit, like the first part of your career, you didn't really think much about that, but and I didn't as well. I really never journaled, but when I started journaling and reflecting in your book, I literally found myself. I'm like, I started to appreciate. It's not a bragging. I started to appreciate what I had accomplished throughout my career.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. So I have a really a good friend and advisor, a woman at Loyola University in Chicago by the name of Janice Fine, and and I really trust her. So when I was early working on that manuscript in 2016, now I sent her an early version of the manuscript and said, could you please read this for me and give me feedback? I really trust your wisdom. So she said, well, I think we need to meet to talk about it. And
Right.
I'll never forget, I met her in this deli in Chicago, and she looked at me and she said, Tim, this is a really nice book. She goes, but you must always keep in mind that as an author, you have an obligation to take care of the reader. In other words, the reader needs to find themselves
Sure.
in the book. If they can't, then why did you write it?
Yeah.
And that really impacted me in terms of like, this can't be about, although it has my stories and those stories have a point, and depending on what your lens is in life as an educator, you'll go, yeah, I can identify with that story. But what I really wanted was for you to connect to your story.
Yeah.
And what does that story bring out of you? And so that advice of your words must take care of the reader is, to hear you say that means a lot to me, because that means I accomplished that. You were able to find yourself in the words, in the work, and find your own story. And Brian, what's really fascinating is that was extremely unique at the time. Like the idea for Solution Tree to put in what we call scholar margins in a book. So when you open a part, there's white space on either. Yeah. So there's these scholar margins, and then there would be lines where you could actually write your own story in it. And I've had so many people come up to me with a book, and they've got Post-it notes in there. They've got stuff they've written over. They've gone back and reread what they wrote and said, well, a couple of years later, now I feel a little differently. I see things a little differently than I did when I wrote back then. And that just really makes me feel good, because in the end, then the book is helping people find themselves, but also appreciate, like you just indicated, their own growth. And that's really awesome.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember this, but as I was reading the book, you were getting texts from me. I was like texting you and saying, this is what is this? What am I doing? Like, I'm just like, I was so excited, and just sharing some of the kind of ahas that I was experiencing throughout the book. I just was just really fortunate to be able to read it and again be able to kind of write my own story or reflect upon my own story.
Well, I will say, I think the other thing that helped too for me was I was a little bit older by the time I wrote it, and I had a lot of journey stories that we all have, because educating kids is kind of a universal experience. And what happened, for example, when I wrote the chapter on what makes you weep, what's worthy of our tears in this profession, you know, it's because I've had moments in my life where all I want to do is sit in my car and cry
That was part of it. I mean, that hit me when you were working with that district and you were frustrated and you went in your car and cried and you're like crying tears for those kids.
Right. Yeah. And that those are the things worthy of us fighting for, as educators, that, and so, but I bet there's been an experience for almost every person who's been if you're in the profession long enough, you eventually at some point in the quiet moment somewhere, you just break down and cry. Yeah. Because you can't win every battle. You can't win with every child. You can't always get the victories. I think we're in a profession sometimes where we feel like we're not enough. Yeah. And honestly, it's why the middle part of the book is on collaboration, because we're not enough alone.
Exactly.
And just quick, really funny, but so with Heart, I wanted each letter to stand for something. So H was all about happiness in the workplace, and E was about engagement and energy in the workplace. And then I got to A and I wanted it to be about collaboration. And thankfully, Susan, my wife, said to me, well, Tim, there's this thing called a synonym. So you could look up words that mean collaboration, right? Start with an A. So of course, in the book, I call it alliances, but it's really about the collaborative nature and the social nature of our work life, and how to use our colleagues to count on them when we're having difficult times, but also to work with them to solve our really complex problems. Yeah. And I think that's part of the secret of the PLC life is that it kind of gives us that opportunity to be so much stronger because we're doing it together.
Yeah, I think, and you know this better than I, you and Rick really, lived this through Stevenson, but I think embracing the PLC culture, it really saves a lot of careers, because like you said, we can't do this all by ourselves. And if we're vulnerable enough and transparent and we're saying, I say, Tim, help me. I don't teach this effectively. I don't know how to work with this student. Can you help me? And Tim's not going to judge me. Tim's going to say, Brian, grab my hand. We're going to walk through this together.
Yeah, I've had that same problem. I've actually experienced those same things. And actually, I'm not 100% sure, but let's try this and see what happens. And we try it together. There's a glue to that, kind of that brings us in. Yeah, absolutely true.
Tim, I usually end my podcasts with this old African proverb: as I go, I am wearing you. Mm. And I shared it at my dad's funeral 3 years ago. And it really is a proverb that my wife shared with me about 15 years ago. But it's all about all the people we are wearing and that we're taking with because they had helped us along the way. And so, when you see Brian Butler, you're not seeing Brian Butler, you're seeing the hundreds of people have poured into him. And so at the beginning of most of my podcasts, I say to my guests, can you talk to me a little bit about your personal journey, your professional story? So let's go back to your personal story, because although, you talked about, you didn't want to make the book about you. You want to make it, those books about, helping people reflect. I think your personal story is one of the most poignant and powerful stories that I have heard in terms of how a person comes through a challenge and has people, your Uncle Al and Dottie, who have connected and came into your life, who you are wearing. And so can you kind of talk about what happened in 1958 and then your journey from there?
Yeah, it is interesting. I've now, Brian, developed a Ignite session. Ignite is where you do 5 minutes presentation, 20 slides, advancing every 15 seconds, whether you're ready for it or not. So the timing has to be perfect. We laugh because most people want to watch you do an Ignite session just to see you fail, because you're not going to necessarily match the slides exactly as they're moving. Right. And the one I do, it's called 606 41st Street. And that is the address of my mother's sister, my Aunt Dottie, and my Uncle Al's home in Rock Island, Illinois, 606 41st Street. And in 58, my parents got divorced. And in the 50s, divorce was kind of, didn't really happen much, or it was very quiet. but they got divorced, and my mother took my brother and I to Tucson, Arizona, and did not put us in school for a year. So that was a problem. So basically, when I should have been in second grade, I didn't go to school at all. Um, and we lived between a motel sometimes and our car at other times. So today we would say that's considered being homeless,
Right.
or in need of a place. But my aunt, my mom's sister, said, "Hey, I'll take Tim in," and so I ended up going back to the Chicago area, to Rock Island, Illinois, and living with my aunt for the next 5 years. And the power of the story is really twofold. One, um, my aunt, who acted in loco parentis and basically took me in as if I was her own child, and helped me to have a place of safety and not chaos, right? The second thing was Mrs. Armstrong, the third grade teacher. So, and the thing I tell people is, if you can just imagine being this third grade teacher who gets this kid in November, who has not been in second grade, that has not been in the first part of third grade,
Yeah.
and he suddenly shows up in your class. And then on top of all that, he's not paying attention. He's not focused. He's not listening. He's not doing any of his work. He doesn't respond when you ask him questions, etc.
Not unlike some of the experiences that our teachers today experience.
Exactly. And one of the things that you and I would say is that part of the heart work of our life is to find out about the whole child. Like, okay, this kid's not behaving the way I want them to. Yes, they are academically behind. So, but what am I going to do about that? How do I respond? And Mrs. Armstrong, and Brian, by the way, Mrs. Armstrong's, when I showed up in her class, her arm was broken. And so her arm was in a cast and a sling. And I remember in my brain, my 7-year-old brain, thinking, this is hysterically funny that her name is Mrs. Armstrong and her arm's broken. But nonetheless,
That's humor.
it was. She comes to my aunt's house and says, I'll never forget this. She tells my aunt, we sit in the kitchen, and she says, we have three choices with your child. Number one, we can send them to the retarded school. And I've had some people say, you probably shouldn't say that word, but I have to tell you, in 58, that's exactly what they said. And that was exactly where you went. And that was considered, the outcast. They don't quite fit in. So we'll just shove them off to that school. The second choice, she said, is just move him back to second grade and put him a year, because he's a year behind. So, he didn't go to second grade, put him back a grade. But Mrs. Armstrong said the third choice is we can get his hearing tested. And it turns out I was born completely deaf in my right ear, and I did not know that. They got my hearing tested. Turns out I have no hearing in my right ear. I only have one good ear, my left ear. And I was sitting in the far back left side of the room, which meant that my bad ear was to the teacher and in the back. So I had no idea that she was even speaking to me at times. Yeah. Mrs. Armstrong said, all right, let's move him to the right front of the room and see what happens. And overnight, I started participating. I started listening. I got engaged. And between her and my Aunt Dottie, I caught up on 1.25 years worth of content before third grade was over. I mean, was I happy about it? No, I wanted to go out and play catch, but my Aunt Dottie made me do 2 hours of schoolwork after school every day. And Mrs. Armstrong gave her materials so that my aunt could work with me. And I have to tell you, I'm saying it pretty non-emotionally here right now, but when I do it in the Ignite session, every single time I show a picture of this house at the end of the session, right, it tears at the fabric of who I am, because I'm like, if Mrs. Armstrong had just not even talked to my aunt, but just said, said to the principal, look, this kid doesn't fit in, send him to the retarded school. I often wonder what would have happened to me, what would have happened to my life, my career, my path. And that's the power that teachers have. They sort of, Tracy Kidder says, you snag children in the river of life. And I was like, yeah, that's it. Mrs. Armstrong snagged me somehow, and as did my aunt. And that was, I suspect for lots of children at whatever grade level or age that happens, sometimes it can happen to a 14-year-old. We snag them along the way and say, no, come on this way. Let's learn more about what's really going on in your life. And that's you know, that's part of the honor of this profession. It can also be part of the burden,
Yeah.
because we're not always, you know, my situation turned out pretty successful, but it doesn't always work out that way. And so, you know, that obviously, I don't know if that's why I became a teacher.
But I think just listening to you, Tim, I think even if it wasn't the reason you became a teacher, it was probably in some way the reason why you don't give up on kids.
Correct. I do believe that. Yeah, that's true.
I mean,
And
no
I,
matter who the student is, because like you said, basically you hit the educational lottery. Mrs. Armstrong, what if you had gone to a different school or had a different teacher? Your trajectory may have been totally different. I mean, I'm just fascinated or in, you know, just kind of surprised that she would even think about your hearing. Like some teachers may not even thought about that. They just would have thought he's just misbehaving or doesn't pay attention.
exactly. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, Brian, that's a really good point, because circling all the way forward, then, you know, I think ultimately, I wrote hard as a way to kind of appreciate, I think the people, the teachers, the educators that read hard, that this is their basic, they're the Mrs. Armstrongs of the world.
Yeah,
And or it begins to get them more in touch with their Mrs. Armstrong.
yeah.
You know, I think, and it's funny to me, because there is no way I could have ever predicted, you know, there's other parts of my story that are just so bizarre. Like when I went back to live with my dad and traveled with a circus for 5 years, and yeah, at a carnival, and, you know, I mean, but
That's
all,
another book.
yeah, it is. All those images sort of, or things sort of shaped, I think, who we become.
Yeah,
But I do want to say, you know, my early years of teaching, 6 years in a small rural district in mid-northern Illinois, where I'm the only math teacher, grades 6, 12,
right.
I think really helped me. I think a lot of those things were instinctual for me, that this is how I wanted to reach out to kids.
Sure.
But it also really made me realize, like, there's still a lot about teaching I have to learn. But I suppose you're right. You know, I always looked at kids differently and felt that I'm here. It's much more about mathematics, even though I became, you know, very entrenched in the academics of mathematics. You know, I think for me, it's always been much more than just the mathematics. The mathematics was the vehicle for reaching kids.
Yeah. I mean, again, I can't imagine you not wearing Mrs. Armstrong, your Aunt
Yeah,
Dottie, who you said was like the heart, and your Uncle Al was like the soul. And I loved the kind
that's
of,
true.
you know, the analogy in your book when you talk about, was it Hokie Carmichael's song Heart and Soul, and
Yeah.
how this is kind of come full circle, right?
Yeah, I really think so. In fact, when I was beginning to think about writing soul, and here's really probably one of the more difficult aspects of it all, but I wanted to follow up part, and I was thinking heart two or whatever. Eventually, heart and soul was in that song,
Yeah.
and Uncle Al teaching me that. It just seemed natural to kind of follow up with that kind of message. Um, but what a lot of people don't know is I took that book, the idea of it. I'd written up a prospectus, and and unfortunately, about 3 weeks before Becky DeFore passed away, I'd taken the book to Becky and said, I'd like you to co-author it with me and write it with me. And unfortunately, she passed away, and I wasn't able to do that. And that's why Soul probably feels the way it does, because I think I was also writing it while I was grieving. It's kind of interesting. Soul's just so much deeper than heart in some ways, in terms of how it asks us to. I mean, bottom line is, soul is all about soul searching,
Yeah.
and I say that your soul search is about finding and sustaining the good inside of you in order to create good in others.
Yeah.
And that again comes back to Mrs. Armstrong, right? Like, and actually, and kind of related to that would be, I had a college professor by the name of Dr. Al Otto, and I was in one of his classes. You know, like, it was an abstract algebra class. The class doesn't matter, but I was sort of skating. I was kind of getting C's. And I remember one night he took me aside and he just said to me, he said, I'm kind of tired of it. I'm sometimes loving kids is tough loving them.
Yeah.
He said, I'm just tired of it. I'm watching you. I don't even know why you're in my class. You're just wasting your time. You're wasting my time. You should be getting A's and you just obviously don't care enough about the class to pay attention. He really kind of let me have it.
Put into you, right?
He did. He really did. And of course I responded to that by proving him wrong and also respecting him enough that I didn't want to let him down.
Sure.
But it also taught me that you can love your students in different ways. You can, and I feel like when I wrote Soul, it was about that. It was about, how, because there's quite a few chapters about validation and belonging under the unifying one. There's quite a, and I wanted to really get at that idea that of our responsibility to create, that you can validate. Yeah. You can validate people in lots of different, your students and your colleagues in lots of different ways. So Soul just goes on a different journey that's, I think, a little bit deeper in some ways.
And I think for me, part was really when you talk about fully forming your professional life, it really was deeper. It was like about me, it personally reflecting. Soul fulfilling the promise. I mean, this is what I'm expected to do. This is my responsibility, my obligation to this profession.
Brian, that's such a great observation. I don't think I've even said it with that kind of clarity. I think Soul, I do talk early on in the book about this second mountain climb, this idea of it's very subtle, but in the beginning of my teaching life, the question I asked is, what is the profession doing for me?
Yeah.
Well, it's giving me a salary, it's giving me health benefits, it's giving me, an opportunity to have a career, et cetera. Maybe it's even recognizing me occasionally by somebody saying thank you, or whether it's parents or right. It's all those things. But it's all about the profession's making me. But at some point we cross over to this place where we say, what is the profession asking of me? Exactly. What is the profession asking of me? Well, it's asking me to work with my colleagues and to make sure we're erasing inequities that go on even in our own teaching, because we're not having conversations around our practices. It's asking me to validate students who may not seem worthy.
Yeah.
I tell a joke. It's a kind of a standard joke that I've told for a long time, but I tell it to make a point. It's just, I ask the audience, like, so do you know what the the best average class size is for teachers? Do you know what the average class size should be? And everybody's like, no, they're not sure what to say. And I say, well, it's the average class size is whatever you have minus 3. And then you get to name the 3. Yeah. And it gets a laugh. But then I say, well, the ideal class size, whatever you have minus 3, whatever. And then I say, well, here's the thing. How do you validate even the 3? How do we go about doing that? How do we create a case of belonging for kids who may not even deserve our validation, but still hunger for it? They just don't necessarily know it at that moment. So I think, that's what the profession asks of us. It asks us to be warm demanders, not to just be nice and kind, but to also say, no, I have high expectations for you too. And I'll help you get there. So it's both. And so the profession asks a lot of us, I think. But once you get to that place, then being about student learning is no longer a big deal, because that's what the profession asks of us. And I get that. Oh, that's why I'm signed up for this. That's why I'm here today. That's why I'm going into work and doing all this hard stuff, because the profession asks me to do these things at a really best practice level, sort of. So,
and once you can own that, it really, no matter what happens, although, like you said, this profession is draining and it's hard and it's challenging and it can beat you down. But once you own that, it's like your why. Then you can move through, because this is my purpose. This is my purpose. So it doesn't matter what arrows are coming at me. My focus is student learning, and to touch that child, that kid, that individual.
Yeah, yeah, and then you're in the and the residue of that purpose are all of the students and all of the colleagues
Yeah,
that have been a beneficiary of being in your pathway,
yeah.
right? Like you said, when you said the proverb, I was thinking
As
about
I
this.
go, I'm wearing you. Yeah,
Yeah, and I was thinking about this, I don't know, article I wrote a long time ago about uh, wearing the coats you wear at Thanksgiving, the old coats. These are your family members, and so on, and the comfortableness of all that, and we are part of that. That is part of who we are,
yeah,
and it it makes sense that it's easy to lose sight of all the people that are the beneficiaries of our lives.
yeah.
That and because you can't, I think for teachers it's just so hard. If I'm a fourth grade teacher, I don't necessarily see that 38-year-old out there
Yeah. It,
who who was impacted by me,
yeah.
you know
That's the difficulty
30
you're
years
right.
ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a preschool teacher. I don't see a middle school kid who I was working with who may have been challenging, but who've had, some challenges, and I poured into that student, and I don't reap the benefits of what I poured into them, but we have to believe, we have to have that faith that they're gonna grow because of what we poured into them.
That's correct. And that it matters. I
Yeah,
think we want to know our work matters, and sometimes that knowing is delayed
yeah,
or it's implied. You don't necessarily, maybe sometimes you see it because you go to a graduation, you see kids walk
right,
across the stage,
right.
that always helps. Or you see the child the next year and you can kind of see they're doing a little bit better, so but it's not just our students, it's also our colleagues. I think that's the powerful part of what we're talking about is, um, I mean, even in Soul, the U part of Soul is about unifying. I kind of had this collaboration theme again built into there, and it is about, our colleagues are the beneficiaries, or should be at least as well. We don't live in isolation, so when that happens, they become my professional family, and I grow because I'm part of that, right?
And it's so important because again, learning is again not in a vacuum, right? And so hence, adult learning and student learning go hand in hand, collectively, right? And so
Yeah.
if we have a great team, then we're going to, make sure that all the kids on our team, have the benefit of our, collective wisdom, expertise, experience, knowledge to give them the best which they deserve.
Yeah, I totally agree. And strangely enough, that's why everything we've just said is if we do that really well, if we do the things I wrote about in Heart and Soul well, I think part of what happens is, though, when I get to the place where what's the profession asking of me, and I take it seriously, then I can easily get worn down. I can easily um feel the depth of that.
Yeah.
And so that's why Tina Boger and I work
Ready to
together
go
to
to educator
educator wellness.
wellness. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why we went there. I just said, Tina, look, you've written some great books on her self-care, for educators book, and her 180 days of self-care, all her mentoring book. I mean, she's just such a great thinker about these
Yeah.
things. And I was like, we need to give educators help on um, how to be physically, mentally, and emotionally strong so that they can deliver on this promise, of what the of what
Sure.
the profession's asking of us. And so it just seemed like a natural next step, I think, for us and for both of us, and I'm really happy with that work too.
Can you talk a little bit about, and I'm just going to kind of jump around a little bit, but in Heart, you talk a little bit about early 2000 when you had your heart attack. Can you
Yeah.
talk about
Yeah.
that? Because that's a major kind of turning point, or at least a major factor in, you know, you, Tim Kanold, don't want to say 2.0, but Tim Kanold moving forward from that point in terms of not just your profession, but personally as well. In terms of now, you were talking about before we started the podcast, you running marathons and making sure you're really healthy. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that and how that really kind of changed you a little bit?
Yeah, I can. And even in the context of it's funny, I tell the heart attack story in the context of collaboration, because it's all about this team of doctors working on me, but then this other team watching them work and observing them and giving them feedback. And so it's about a formative process of learning. And I use it to kind of make a point about teacher walkthroughs and how we can all learn from one another and not being afraid of feedback from our colleagues, et cetera. But the reality is, these days I talk about it and I ask everyone in my audience, that because the wellness sessions are always packed, I just say, okay, because one of our routines under physical wellness is movement. And so I just say, all right, I want you to think of a time when you stopped moving. Like, even if you're moving now and you're doing all kinds of great, you're doing 30 minutes of walking a day or whatever, that's great. But can you think of a time when you stopped moving? And I have them reflect on that. And I said, well, I want to tell you when I stopped moving. It was 1998. And I was, then I just explained, and I said, and I stopped moving, and I have this list of reasons that I have people they can choose from. And my story hits all the reasons. And so I'd stopped moving because I gotten injured. And so, I kind of was like, I need to take some time off.
Right.
Then I was working on my doctorate, and I was going to school. I was going nights. I'm coaching both my kids and their teams, basketball and baseball. My older kids now, but at the time they were in middle school, high school. I'm of course doing my job full time. I'm writing math textbooks. I've got all this stuff going on in my life. We're just, it's just, you're spinning all the plates. You've got it.
Yep.
So long story short, I just stopped moving. Like I stopped any intentional activity that would physically take care of myself. And sometimes when you do that and you're not eating right anymore and you're kind of eating on the run and you're just, I'm 47 years old at the time, and you just think, like life will be forever. And so what happened was, 4 years later, I'm now superintendent at Stevenson. I'd just taken over. And sure enough, my body said, well, fine. You want to ignore this for 4 years? Well, here you go. And sure enough, I'm going through a 7-hour operation, in 2002. But that was thankfully, and that whole process, since about now 2009, I've had no problems at all. I do try to eat better and move better and kind of try to stay up on all of it. And it's not about that, but it was about, I allowed myself to get to a place where then this really serious event happened and I had to kind of regroup and go, okay. And sometimes I think, Brian, we move for artificial reasons. Like, for example, oh, I want to lose weight. That's fine, but that's external. I want to look better. Even that's external. But an internal reason to move would be like, I don't ever want to have a heart attack again. I'm going to keep moving because that will keep my heart stronger. An internal reason to move would be in 2035, I'll have 2 grandchildren that will walk across the stage from high school. I'd like to see both of them walk across the stage. That's why I'm moving today. Yeah. My internal reason is far bigger than any external reason about how it may help me look or feel. Even though those are good things, they're not sustainable. We sometimes have to look at what's the real reason I need to do this, and what will be the benefit of it. And then in collaboration with it, it really helps because I have someone in my life with my wife, Susan, who wants to move also. She too wants to do this. So the fact that we work at this together, we go on hikes together, we intentionally are doing things. We eat better because we're both making the decision to eat better, right? And to make good decisions about that. So it's not that that's great, but in terms of that's the right answer, how for us. But what I do think worked was that journey back, which was about 7 years before I was finally kind of back to completely normal while also still working and doing everything else you do. I don't think I'd be where I am at this moment, even here in this, podcast with you, if if I hadn't responded appropriately to what happened and had this kind of second chance. So yeah, I think I'm very grateful that I had really great surgeons and people that worked on me, cardiac folks, and at the hospital and subsequent follow-up.
Do you think, and again, I might be reaching a little bit, but do you think what you went through as a child and some of the challenges that you experienced give you this inner will, this inner drive to, be successful in any, with any challenge that you might be faced? So the heart attack gives you this will, like, I'm not going to let this beat me. Or is it just that you just want to, like you said, those internal things? Maybe it's a combination. I don't know.
I think it's a combination. I don't know where it comes from, and I don't know, but I've always had this internal mindset. I think, I don't know if it's a drive. It's more of a mindset of this obligation to get the most out of life I can, to enjoy. We have a family saying, "Carpe diem." It might sound trite, but that's our kind of fam bam. We call it our saying, and we all. I'm very aware of wanting to get the best out of this day that I'm in, and I have felt that way almost my whole life, and I have no idea why. I don't know for sure where that comes from, and that sustains you when things are, because I've had a lot of really tough moments in life, and including being at one point, really struggling financially, in those early years of teaching and so on. But I think that that drive or that mindset is constant for me. It's like it's just how I sort of see the world, and that's, and I do see all of the stuff that go. In fact, when I wrote Soul, COVID was happening. There was a lot of kind of, we had sort of a rebirth of so much of the social unrest in our country, social justice unrest. So I knew that. I mean, I felt it and I could feel it and I could emotionally attach to it.
Sure.
But compassion is about responding to it, not just dwelling in it.
Yeah.
I think self-compassion is about making a decision to relieve yourself of your suffering. And so that's what I wanted to do. I think I've always made an attempt to do that, to be aware that I'm suffering, and then and that these things affect me, but making it the choice of, but here's how I'm going to walk through life in order to embrace that suffering and encounter it and deal with it.
One of the things, I can't remember which book it was in, but you talked about this idea of stress, and stress is not bad, but if you're in a constant state of stress, then that's not great. And I think that's what you're saying. You're choosing to make sure that you might have some challenges or suffer, or you're in a state of stress, but you choose not to stay there.
Yeah, that's really true. In fact, there is quite a bit of neuroscience, brain research now. We talk about it in the wellness book about stress is actually good for us because it keeps us alive. It makes us feel like we're doing things that are worthy, and so on. That living a full, busy, kind of complete, wholesome, whole-filled life, I should say. Kind of not wholesome, but whole, where you're feeling like you're in a sweet spot, but you're not overwhelmed by it all,
Right.
is really a good thing, because to actually be bored would be worse.
Yeah.
But when you get to the point where you're hurried and you're overstressed because you can't keep up with all the demands that are on your plate and so on, that's not good. And that's why I write so much about living a more balanced life. Like really taking time out of your day to reflect, to get quiet, to remove yourself from all the noise and the social media noise of your world, and just be really selfish for a brief amount of time every day. Sherry Turkle, who's a professor at MIT and has written a lot of, she's a technology and kind of psychology professor. And she has said that in order for you and I to be in healthy relationships with one another, we really need to find time for solitude every single day. That if you want to be in relationships with other people that are healthy, then you must also be comfortable being in a relationship with yourself at some point of every day, and just getting quiet and away from all the noise, and getting comfortable with that quiet, with that solitude. And you can write or journal or reflect or whatever, but that balance is really helpful, and sometimes even allows you to maybe process, like, okay, so why am I not sleeping better? Or why am I not doing this? Like, what can I do to change those routines? I think all that kind of stuff is helpful because our jobs are just so demanding. So I think finding time, teaching is such a reflective practice, but and so we're always reflecting about others. But what do we do to reflect for ourselves so that, we can kind of examine ourselves? So I just
The book Heart.
encourage anyone listening to
Heart and
this.
Soul. We use those books to help us reflect.
Yeah, and that's why I
Exactly.
think that's part of the secret, right? Yeah, it gives you, that's something good to do during that quiet time.
Tim, I really appreciate this. You have been awesome. And, I always, talk about the people who I wear. You're one of those people who I wear, all over the place. Rick and Becky and Bob have been, heroes of mine, and people who I, really respected, and they mentored me as well. And I've had a lot of people who have, just poured into me. But when you came to me and asked, could you interview me and write that chapter 7, I believe, in Soul on my story, one, it made me feel great because you felt like I had something to offer, but it also made me in awe because I'm like, Tim Kanold asked me to be in a book, which was pretty cool.
Well, Brian, I appreciate that, but your story is so compelling, and and I felt like it needed to be told, and to be honest, when I asked you, I'm like, okay, because it's going to be public, and are you really willing for your story to be told?
Yeah.
And I'm really glad you did, and it's such a powerful story.
Well, I do appreciate
Your
it.
educational journey is such a powerful story, and it provides a lens, I think, for a lot of people who can feel that story, and it's their story too. So, Brian, it offers so much to so many people, and I think that's part of what I wanted Soul to do, was to help that as well.
I think we all have our stories, and I think as much as we can share those stories, because it's not about us, it's about, like you said, how can we make a connection, or have somebody out there say, oh, he or she went through this, I can go through this, or he or she went through this and wasn't successful in this area. I'm okay because I wasn't successful yet. I can get better, or whatever. I think we all, what your books do is they connect us. I mean, how do we, there's so much out there that can divide us, but your books connect us. What do we have in common? These soul stories, these heart stories, we all have this yearning to want to, get better, want to do better, want to help, want to support. And that's a connection for us.
Yeah, believe it or not, and it's funny you say that, because when I think back about your story that's in the book, one of the early parts of your story that just connected for me was when I can't remember, you injured your knee. I can't remember if it was your kneecap or your knee.
Yes, I hurt my knee. Yeah, I had two
Yeah,
knee surgeries, yeah.
and pretty severely, to the point where that wasn't going to be your career path anymore.
Yeah.
And you had to kind of reinvent yourself,
Yeah.
and the courage it took to do that. So see, that's what I mean. There's these inflection points in our life path that just.
Yeah. And again, that courage came with people saying, you can do this, right?
Yeah. How many times
Yeah,
did that keep happening to you? Right.
exactly.
Yeah. I just love that, and I think that's why we're teachers, because that's the power we can provide for others. We keep stewarding them along. We keep telling, and it's not just enough. We don't just say you can do this. We say you can do this, and I will be there to help you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, nothing greater. Here's the thing I'll just say is, I don't think there's anything greater than our profession. I cannot imagine anyone, when you look at the World Health Organization's definition of mental wellness, The very last part of the definition says, in order to better serve our community within which we live. And I'm like, is that not exactly what we're called to do? We are serving the community. Maybe we don't live in that exact community or whatever, but we're serving the greater community, the next generation of humans that are going to come forward as young adults. And I'm like, I don't know if there's anything greater. You know, it's such a, you know, and obviously I'm looking back on it with a long history. But I do feel like no matter where you're at in your teaching journey, even if you're in your early years, you can feel that you're providing you're improving the community in within which people live because you've chosen to be an educator.
All you have to do is walk in to your building and look into a child's eyes, and you can see a light bulb go on, or some type of connection, or something, or even something as simple as a child who may not have a lot of food at home, and they come into a school that has a free breakfast, and you see their eyes because they're able to eat. We provide so much, Tim, and I think, as you said before, sometimes we don't see the fruits of our labor, but we are pouring into so many kids and so many colleagues, as you said, that we are changing the world.
Yeah, I think so. And I really, yeah. You know, one last thing I'll just say real quick was the last student teacher I ever had was a woman named Linda Rush, and she was a math teacher. And Linda eventually joined me at Stevenson. She worked the whole time I was there at Stevenson, and she retired. Her retirement year was when COVID hit in March of 2020, and that would be her last year of teaching. So in March of 2020, her kids get ripped away from her, and she's just dying on the inside because they're not coming back. She didn't get to say goodbye. It's just all of a sudden decisions made. Kids aren't showing up anymore. And she had like probably 145, 155 kids, somewhere in there. And she's not even going to have like a faculty farewell thing, right? She was retiring after her entire career at Stevenson in one place. But she did something. She hand wrote a letter to every single one of her students during COVID and sent it to their home, telling them just how much they appreciated, you know, and even she goes, even my husband thought I was a little nuts because, you know, really, I'm going to write all these letters to my students. And she said what was amazing was the response she got back. And with even her most quiet students, you know, kind of saying, you know, Mrs. Rush, thank you for this, or thank you for that, you know, just reaching out. And in that outpouring response, like, if she probably would never have even known that, because they wouldn't, some of them who are shy just wouldn't have the courage to say it. I just love that. Like,
that was a gift, actually.
It goes on everywhere.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, that's pretty cool.
I appreciate you. That's a great story to end on. I appreciate you so much. As I said, I am wearing you, and so many people around the world, you know, all the books and, you know, the people you've spoken to and the educators you have influenced, they are wearing you. They are wearing Tim Kanold, and you have influenced generations. Just know that, and I think you know that.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that. But it's just as we are all that way. There, you know, I stand on the shoulders of so many other people, and I'm kind of shaped by the opportunities that they gave me as well. So I appreciate it. You're a good man.
Well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you coming on a conversation with Brian, and we'll talk to you very soon. Thanks, Tim.
All right. Take good care. Thanks again, Brian.
Bye.
All right.
Subscribe to A Conversation with Brian on my YouTube channel and Spotify.